Flight controls timing. Fire on. All throttle on. All throttle on. Dead toast. Check. Navigation.
Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas!
Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are going to be taking a look at yet another Airbus offering for Microsoft Flight Simulator. This time though, of course, we are back in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020, and we're going to be taking a look at the FSLabs A321. FSLabs, as I'm sure many of you are aware, do have a little bit of a checkered past. We'll touch more on that towards the end of the video. Whatever you may think of the company and its practices though, without a doubt their add-ons are some of the finest and most detailed examples of simulated aircraft that you'll find available for PC-based flight simulation. So of course, in today's video we're going to be putting the aircraft through its paces and seeing whether or not the A321 does enough to stand out from the crowd. You'll notice as well that we are feeling pretty festive in today's video. This is going to be my last video ahead of the Christmas holidays. So as usual, to help us get into the spirit of things, there will be a prize giveaway and as well a charity fundraiser, details for both of which will be down in the video description below. As has become tradition on the channel at this time of year, we are going to be once again featuring the home of Santa Claus, so departing today out of Rovaniemi. For our flight, as you can see, we are going to be operating a Jet 2 A321 on a return service back from Rovaniemi. Our very happy passengers having just seen Santa Claus and now returning home to Manchester. The flight time today will be 2 hours and 55 minutes. Nice conditions here out of Rovaniemi. Unfortunately, the weather in Manchester later on pretty bleak. We're expecting 213 passengers on board the jet, cruising our way home initially at flight level 340 and uplifting just shy of 12.5 tonnes of fuel. As usual, we're going to be carrying out a full flight and of course an in-depth review along the way, and we'll have our passengers back on the ground, cosy at home, well ahead of Christmas. As always, I really hope you enjoy the flight. If you do, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. And if you would like to help support the content further, you can do so by becoming a channel member or patron. Okay, so today then we find ourselves back on the flight deck of yet another Airbus. In fact, I think this is probably the largest number of concurrent Airbus videos I've done here on the channel. Once more on stand 7 here at Rovaniemi. And of course we find ourselves in the cockpit of the FSLabs A321. As you can see, the aircraft is currently cold and dark, not entirely representative of most typical real-world flights. But I wanted to run through the full startup, give you a good feel for the level of systems depth, and as well hear the very nice sound set that's included with the jet. So coming up to the overhead, we'll take the battery masters on, number 1. Number 2, you can see we do have ground power available, so we'll take that on here as well. And the aircraft now powering up. Once again, very good level of systems depth on board the aircraft. I think that goes without saying. And as well, as you can hear, overall a very nice sound set. So just slightly out of sequence here, we're going to start with the onboard tablet, the EFB. We'll come down to that. We'll cover off most of the features later on during the flight. For now, just focusing initially on the tech log, which is a really nice and highly realistic feature which you don't tend to see very much in any flight simulators. Certainly not much in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So in terms of items for us here today, nothing particularly exciting. We have a seal damage left-hand belly fairing. No performance impact for us, there's no reference there for us either. You can see there the item expires on the 16th of the 1st, 29 days remaining. And the other item, pretty trivial, just a cabin tray table condition that expires in 119 days. Again, no reference for us. So again, nothing particularly exciting in terms of what we're going to encounter here for the flight. Certainly nothing that's going to impact the performance of the flight. You can see the next daily check there due in 1 day and 4 hours. And in terms of fault history, you can see we've had a couple of other items previously. There were door 2L bonding lead, the door unlocked decal missing, and as well overhead bin damage. So overall, again, nothing particularly interesting, but if there was an MEL or CDL reference for us, we do have a comprehensive document suite included with the aircraft, including an MEL with all of the relevant items. Lastly, whilst we're here down at the EFB, it's worth noting as well, we've already carried out some takeoff performance calculations. The data there has just reset, but we calculated it as per current conditions for runway 21 here at Rovaniemi. That gave us a V1 range of between 154 and 159 knots. This is based off an 81.7 ton takeoff. We've gone with 156 for V1, 159 for VR, 162 for V2. Acceleration altitude 2210 is going to be a config 1 departure, up 0.4 on the stab, and a flex air of 40 degrees. As you can see, overall the takeoff performance calculation here is quite a bit more in depth than we see on the Phoenix, quite a lot more data there for us. And generally speaking, I think that's fair to say in terms of the FSLabs aircraft. I think it does offer more depth and more realism than the Phoenix Airbus. Certainly, as you've seen with the tech log there and as well these performance calculations, if you are looking to make your simming just that much more realistic and that much closer to real-world operations, then the FSLabs A321 certainly has quite a few tricks up its sleeve. Anyway, that'll do us for now in terms of the EFB. Again, we'll come back to that later on. In terms of the setup, we'll come up to the overhead panel, we'll take the crew oxygen supply on. Same as well for the CVR ground control. The ADIOs can go through to nav. With the lights, we'll take the strobes through to auto, nav lights onto system 1. No smoking signs can go through to auto. In terms of the belts, we've got 12.2 tons of fuel on board the jet. Nicely balanced, and that is as per the flight plan, so plenty to get us back home. We'll take the belts on. Emergency exit lights can go through to armed. The cabin pressurization, the landing elevation selector set through to auto. Air conditioning panel looks good. Same there as well for the electrical panel, obviously leaving the external power on for the time being. We'll start the APU up later on, just ahead of the boarding. Fuel pumps can go on. We'll carry out an APU fire tests. And same here as well for engine 1. You can hear there the sound set just cutting in and out a little bit between the various sound effects. And good fire test there on both engines and the APU. Right hand side of the overhead panel looks good. Coming down to the forward main instrument panel, we've got 989 set there on the standby for the QNH. Brake accumulator pressure looks good in terms of the date. 17th of the 12th, time looks good. Anti-skid nose wheel steering switch selected on. Coming down to the left hand of the pedestal, we'll set up the MCDU in just a moment's time. RMP and ACP as usual, we'll leave those as is, not required for the flight. Weather radar and predicted wind shear are selected off. The tilt will just come through to up 4 degrees. Some of these selections are a little bit strange. You can't actually click and hold. You have to either use the mouse wheel or constantly click to activate some of the switching. The cockpit door, we'll leave that open for now, although it is worth noting, as best I can tell, you can't actually access the cabin currently via the door, which is a little bit disappointing. The hydraulics, you can see there, all 3 systems, quantities look good. For the engines, 17.5 quarts for the engine oils, that looks good. And the cockpit oxygen pressure is checked. Thrust levers are in the idle position. Engine masters are off, engine start selector in the normal position. Spoilers disarmed, part brake is set, flaps are up. And just checking the configuration there on the EWD. We need to turn on the first officer's MCDU here as well. So we'll just wait for that to initialize. Again, we can leave the RMP and ACPs as they are. And for the transponder, we'll leave that in standby. System 1, altitude reporting on. TCAS, we've got that set through to above and standby. Again, somewhat out of sequence, but for the EFRO selections, we've got the flight director selected there on both sides. We'll set VORs here as well on both sides. Now we'll take constraints. We'll go with ARC 20. And for the FCU, for the time being, we'll just set 5,000. That's going to be our clearance limit initially in terms of the altitude. That's about it then in terms of the initial setup. We'll start the boarding fairly shortly. Just the cargo going on here at the moment. So we'll get the door opened up here as well. Going on to the connections page, we can open up the L1 door. And coming now down then to the MCDU, we'll set that up for the flight. So firstly, MCDU menu, FMGC. In terms of the aircraft, A321-200 CFM56 engines. The nav database is not currently valid, but it will do for the flight. GPS primary is lost, we'll clear the message. Onto the init page, we're departing out of Rovaniemi, which is Echo Foxtrot Romeo Oscar. And we are bound for Manchester, Echo Golf Charlie Charlie. Alternate for the flight today is Liverpool, Echo Golf Golf Papa. And flight number, Echo X-Ray Sierra 2512. Jet 2 for the flight, of course. Cost index is 30. Initial cruise flight level 340. The IRS init, just aligning based on the GPS position, so we've got 6633.5. That's checked, and we've got 2549.6. 2549.6 will align on the reference. We'll leave the chopper pause and cruise flight level temperatures as they are. With the flight plan, departing out of Rovaniemi, runway 21, and we're going to be flying the Nemgu 3 Alpha departure. That of course takes us out towards waypoint Nemgu. From there we'll be tracking direct to waypoint Rekmi, Romeo Echo Kilo Mike India. Then it'll be direct to waypoint Tigba, Tango India Golf Bravo Alpha. Then direct to waypoint Dopux, Delta Oscar Papa Uniform X-Ray. And then direct to waypoint Clon, Kilo Lima Oscar November November. Nearly there in terms of the flight plan setup. Direct to waypoint Robem, Romeo Oscar Bravo Echo Mike. And from there we can finally pick up an airway. So it'll be the Upper Papa 16. Out towards waypoint Nateb, then we'll pick up the Papa 18. So you can see that takes us out towards Nateb, the aircraft automatically calculating that based on the next airway. From Papa 18, it'll be waypoint Tilney, Tango India Lima November India. We can insert all of that and then into Manchester, expecting runway 23 right, we'll be flying the Tilney 1 Mike arrival, which of course we pick up from waypoint Tilney. In terms of the secondary, we'll just make that a copy of the active. For the RadNav page, we'll leave everything auto-tuning. Init B then, our current zero fuel weight is estimated at 71.3 tons. And the max zero fuel weight 28.1. Block fuel, as mentioned, is 12.2 tons. And in terms of diversion fuel today, again, Liverpool the alternate, we need 2.2 tons for the diversion. For the performance, as mentioned, V1 154, VR is 159, and V2 is 162. Transition altitude is 5,000 feet as per the chart. Thrust reduction and acceleration 2110 as we mentioned. Once more, it's going to be a config 1 departure up 0.4 on the stab. And as we discussed, it'll be a flex of 40 degrees. In terms of initial speed restriction on the departure, you can see there we have an initial speed restriction of 230 knots. Green dot's 235, so technically we want to hold flaps 1, but we can still 5 knots. So we'll pre-select 235, and that will allow us to clean the aircraft up here on the departure. That's in terms of the progress page. We'll just go Rovaniemi, Echo Foxtrot Romeo Oscar, runway 21. So the box is set up, the aircraft is now set up. We'll commence the boarding shortly. In terms of the briefing, we do have Navigraph functionality integrated into the EFB. We'll take a look at that during the flight. We're now just briefing off the paper chart. So once more, expecting the Nemgu 3 Alpha departure. It's actually 4 Alpha now in the current real-world database. It's plate 10-3 Bravo, it's an RNAV SID. We will see GPS primary later on. The SID's fairly straightforward. It takes us out initially towards waypoint Lalma. Again, max speed there is 230 knots. We're holding 235 to clean up. And then ultimately out towards waypoint Nemgu. In terms of the notes, after takeoff we want to climb as rapidly as possible to at least 2650 on the altimeter. So we'll hold 235 until we're up through that altitude. Maintaining tower frequency until passing 2,000 feet, we'll then contact Rovaniemi radar. And no altitude limit here on the chart, again expecting 5,000 feet from ATC during the clearance. In terms of the terrain, nil significant, highest sector MSA 2,400 feet. Aerodrome elevation is notable, it's 643 feet. Otherwise not particularly bad overall, quite a nice day. Fairly chilly outside, minus 17 degrees, the wind straight down the runway. So we are anticipating icing conditions. We do have visible contamination around at the airfield. We've catered for that with the takeoff performance data. We've got engine anti-ice selected on. Otherwise though, the weather very nice if we did need to make a return in towards Rovaniemi. In terms of the taxi, currently on stand 7 as we mentioned at the main apron, we'll be pushing back onto taxiway Tango. We'll then be making a left turn Tango all the way down to holding point Echo for a full-length departure off runway 21 as calculated. Once more, as best I can tell at the moment, there's no way of actually accessing the cabin of the aircraft. It seems as though we can't get through that cockpit door, so unfortunately we're not going to be able to take a look around that. I did a little bit of reading around online. It does seem as though FSLabs have mentioned there will be a high-fidelity cabin model at a later date. Obviously though, if I'm correct, it is a little bit disappointing that we don't have that upon release, especially given the price. Anyway, again, boarding will commence very shortly, so we'll wait for the passengers to come on board, and I'll join you back here again for the push and start.
Very shortly returning to Manchester. We're all ready to go at the front here now, just waiting on the last of the bags to be loaded. When that's complete, we'll be able to push back and start. Taxi out for departure today on the southwest of the runway. Flight time of 2 hours and 20 minutes.
Okay, so the boarding is now complete. We are now ready for the push and start. As you can see, all of our doors are now closed up. We've got the APU running, the APU bleed on here as well. We'll take the beacon on ahead of the push. We'll take the transponder through to auto. And in terms of the before start checks, the cockpit preparation has been completed. Gear pins and covers have been removed. The signs are on and auto. That is set through to nav. We do now have GPS primary. In terms of the fuel quantity, again 12.2 tonnes on board the jet. The fuel is balanced. Takeoff data, we have a V1 154, VR 159, V2 of 162, and a flex temp there of 40 degrees. Power ref, we have a QNH of 989 on all 3 altimeters. And below the line, the windows and doors are closed. Beacon is on, thrust levers are idle, the park brake will take off. That is the before start checklist complete. So we'll commence the push, and we'll start both engines. So engine start selected through to ignition start. The aircraft does integrate technically with GSX, but as you can see there, we've left our tug behind just using the default sim system here for the pushback today. So we'll start engine 2. Again, a little bit of choppiness there in terms of the sound set. And I'll keep fairly quiet here during the start. I get quite a lot of complaints during my video that I talk too much through the start. It's a little bit tricky to see there, but we do have N2 rotation. And the oil pressure is coming up. Okay, there's our light off. You can see the EGT coming up, the fuel flow increase there as well. So good start there on engine 2. We do have the avail indication. We'll just monitor the push. So we'll stop the push, beam Tango, we'll take the park brake on, tug and clear, and we'll start engine 1. The engine start sequence does seem perhaps just a touch quick from start through to available, but I haven't flown the CFM engines, to be fair. There's a veil. So 2 good starts. We'll set the start selector back through to normal. Start the chrono. APU bleed can go off. Same there as well for the APU master. Reset the rudder trim, arm up the spoilers. Again, it's going to be a config 1 departure. So there's config 1 selected on the flaps. Up 0.4 on the THS. And for the doors, we do now have all of our slides armed. Good start then for the after start checks, the anti-ice. We'll select on. ECAM status is checked. Pitch trim we have up 0.4 units. Rudder trim is 0. That is the after start. Checklist complete. We'll take the runway turn-offs on. Same as well for the nose light. That can go through to taxi. All clear here on the right hand side. Clear as well on the left. It's going to be a left hand turn. We'll come onto the Navigraph charts page. And once more, we're on the apron. We'll be taxiing left onto Tango, then Tango all the way down to holding point Echo for a full-length departure. The setup in terms of the actuation of both the rudder pedals and the nose wheel steering here I find to be a little bit funny. You can use your hardware for both, but you actually have to have the pedal disconnect push button held in order to use your pedals for nose wheel steering. So part brake off. The jet here not wanting to move under idle power, but we are fairly heavy. And only needing a little bit of thrust to get moving, about just shy of 30% there on the M1, so that's quite reasonable. So again, I do find the actuation of the nose wheel steering a little bit strange. You can elect to turn that option off, but then you don't have any control, it seems, over the nose wheel steering. I suppose that FSLabs are trying to be a little bit more realistic in that respect, but overall, of course, you do have to make some concessions for the average user's hardware setup. Anyway, just joining on to Tango. Back to idle now on the thrust levers. I do find as well that the nose wheel steering almost feels as though it has a bit of a dead zone. It's not at all sensitive initially, and then you get quite a big swing all of a sudden. There, ground speed, currently doing 10 knots. We'll keep the thrust back at idle. Give ourselves plenty of time for the setup. In terms of the flight controls then, we have full up, pull down, and neutral, pull left, pull right, and neutral, and we'll avoid actuating the rudder here again just so that we don't spear off the taxiway. In terms of the briefing, once again it's going to be the Nemgu 3 Alpha departure off runway 21 out towards waypoint Lalma, and a right turn ultimately out towards Nemgu, and we have an initial speed restriction of 230 knots, but again cleaning up at 235. On the FMA there we have climb now blue 5000 1FD2, and there are no changes to the brief. So we'll take terrain on the first officer's side, auto brake through to max, carry out a takeoff config test, and lastly for the weather radar we'll come on to system 1. Predicted wind shear can go through to auto. I don't believe the weather radar currently modelled on the jets, as per most aircraft in Microsoft Flight Simulator. Okay, so continuing down Tango. In terms of the before takeoff items, the flight controls have been checked, flight instruments are checked, briefing is confirmed. For the flap setting, we have config 1+F. V-speed and thrust, again we have V1 154, VR 159, V2 162, and flex of 40 degrees. ATC is set. We'll take the transponder on a little bit ahead of time, so TARA. And for the ECAM memo, we have takeoff no blue. That is the before takeoff checklist down to the line. So continuing down Tango for the time being. And once more, we'll hold short at Echo. It's going to be a full-length departure off runway 21.
Norseman 5 on Quebec, contact tower, Rovaniemi. And videre 300 Yankee, contact tower, Rovaniemi.
Okay, so we are now lined up here on runway 21. We have completed the last of our before takeoff items. The before takeoff checklist below the line, the cabin crew have been advised. The engine start selector is normal, the packs are on. That is the before takeoff checklist complete. So part brake off. Through to 50% on the M1s initially. And take off. It is quite nice and easy to find the flex detents without looking at the throttles, which is always nice. And again, pretty great sounds from the aircraft. So Manflex 40, SRS runway, auto thrust blue. Thrust is set. The aircraft feels really good as well in terms of rudder response. There's 100 knots. Fairly slow here in the acceleration. Got a fairly modest flex, but we are pretty heavy weight. There's V1 and VR. And a lot of swing there to the left, putting in almost full right rudder to keep the aircraft straight down the runway centre line. Pitching up to around 12.5 degrees. Okay, we have nav. We do have positive climb. We'll retract the gear, pitch for the flight directors. And I've got a boot full of right rudder in here to keep the aircraft straight. We'll just hold the ECAM till we're up through 400 foot on the rad out. We'll cancel the master caution. And no need to be a hero here today, so we'll take the autopilot. It's autopilot 1. Up through 400 feet, so for the ECAM we have engine 1 fail. That is confirmed. Engine mode selector ignition. That is ignition. Thrust lever 1 idle. Number 1 is confirmed. And we do have to be a little bit careful doing this. It's easy to actuate the THS trim at the same time. If we do that, we'll kick out the autopilot. Okay, so we've got number 1 idle. If no relight after 30 seconds, it has been 30 seconds. Engine master 1 off. Number 1 confirmed. That is off. If damage, I think we did have damage there. It was a significant rundown. No bang, but I think that's not associated with anything modelled in the sim. We don't have rotation there on either N1 or N2, so we'll assume damage. So engine 1, fire push button push. Number 1 is confirmed. That is push. The animation for that is a little bit basic if I was being very picky. Okay, Agent 1 after 4 seconds will discharge. Agent 1 discharged. And if no damage, Engine 1 at relight consider, we've already discussed that. The engine is now secure, so we'll hold the ECAM. And we're waiting till we're up through 2100 feet, or 2110 as per the box for the acceleration. So we'll just continue on with the ECAM items here till we're up through 2110 on the altitude. For the shutdown then, if no fuel leak, we'll monitor the fuel situation, but in terms of a datum, currently burn through about 220 kilos on the right, 60 on the left. If we add that to the fuel on board, that does still add up to 12.2, so we're good in terms of any fuel leak for the time being. We can revisit that later on. TCAS mode selected TA. Come through to TA. Avoid icing conditions. Whilst we do have the engine anti-ice selected on, there's no significant icing conditions at the moment. We are clear of any moisture. So we'll clear engine 1. And again, we'll just stop the ECAM, approaching 2100 feet or just above. We'll push for the level off. So we have VS0. And you can see the jet is now going to the level segment. We'll wait until we're above S-speed here before we retract the flaps. That's going to take quite some time. So again, we'll just continue on with the ECAM, purely here for the sake of the video. In reality, we'd be prioritizing things a little bit differently. So for the secondary failures, we have land ASAP in amber. For the air, obviously we've lost engine 1. We have engine 2 supplying pack 2. We'll clear air. For the elec, obviously again we've lost generator 1. We've got gen 2 powering AC bus 2 and AC bus 1, and as a result we'll start up the APU here as well for a little bit of redundancy. Just give me an eye there on that speed. As well, we have the galley partially shed. So the APU should be coming online fairly shortly. We'll clear elec. And lastly, for the hydraulics, loss of green engine driven pump there, of course, with the loss of engine 1. We've still got the yellow and blue systems. And as you can see there, the PTU supplying pressure to the green hydraulic system. Quantities look good. So again, we'll clear hydraulics. In terms of the status, again, we'll just stop the ECAM. Waiting here till we're up through S-speed. You can see here the jet very slow to accelerate on that single engine. We are still, though, using a flex takeoff thrust. Of course, we could come through to Takeoff if we needed it in terms of performance, but no significant terrain around above the MSA. Up through S-speed. We'll go flaps 0. And the speed trend vector there now above green dot. So we can pull for an open climb. We have open climb out blue 5,000. And once we come through green dot, we should see lever MCT there on the prompt for the thrust levers. So we'll just wait until we see that, and then we'll continue on with the ECAM. Lever MCT. So we'll just bring the thrust levers back into the detent. We have thrust MCT, auto thrust. And we'll keep the speed back towards green dots. In terms of the status then, we have avoid icing conditions. We've discussed that already. If no engine 1 damage, we've assessed there is damage, so we're not going to relight. We have Cat 3 single only in terms of landing capability. And for the in-op systems, wing anti-ice, Cat 3 dual, engine 1 bleed, Pack 1, Gen 1, and green engine 1 pump. The APU is now available, so that should be taking up some of the load. You can see that's now powering AC bus 1. So back to the status page. And we can remove the status, that is the ECAM actions complete. Obviously in this state we aren't heading over towards Manchester, we'll want to return to Rovaniemi, so first things first, we'll track back towards the field. We'll request from ATC direct to waypoint Vekip, which is Victor Echo Kilo India Papa. Just check that here on the nav display. That is direct Vekip. We'll insert. And we're going to want to take up the hold here as we sort everything out. So the hold at Vekip. It's inbound 024. It will be a left-hand turn. And it will be a 1-minute leg. So we can insert all of that. We might as well just set up the rest of the approach very briefly here as well. We'll discuss it more later on. So from Vekip, new destination Rovaniemi, Echo Foxtrot, Romeo Oscar. And we can insert that. And coming back for the RLS Zulu, runway 21. No need for an approach, but we will take via waypoint Vekip. So inserting all of that, the aircraft is now going to navigate us back towards Vekip. We'll take up the hold. Once we're established in the hold, we'll fully discuss the EFB in terms of its functionality. We'll run through a couple of checklists, and then we'll run through a landing performance calculation. We'll brief up the approach, we'll then get the aircraft set up for the approach, and we'll fly the return back for the RLS onto runway 21 at Rovaniemi.
Hello again, Northman 51 Quebec 2001, climbing 6000 at 2 and 1 out.
Northman 51 Quebec, good morning, Roger, identified climb flight level 170.
Climb level 170, Northman 51 Quebec.
Green side 208, first right, contact ground 1216.
Okay, so we are now established here in the hold at Vekip, the airfield just off the nose, and as you can see, 2020 still looking pretty resplendent here overall. We're maintaining 5,000 feet, speed just above green dot. We've got over 11 tons of fuel still on board the aircraft, and as you can see, we are still above max landing weight there, 82.5 tons currently. As mentioned then, whilst we're established here in the hold, we'll take the opportunity to take a look at the onboard tablet. So coming onto the home page, we'll just look through each feature in turn. Firstly, in terms of the documents. Once again, the aircraft does come with a pretty comprehensive document suite. We have a tutorial which is very in-depth and very nicely done, as well as a tutorial for using GSX with the aircraft. Normal procedures, so essentially here, your FCOM, that outlines how to operate the aircraft as per the real-world procedures. A checklist QRH here as well, which is very nice. We'll be using that in just a moment's time. And lastly, the MEL, which, as we looked at earlier on, we can use in conjunction with the TechLog feature. So we'll come back to the QRH in just a moment. In terms of connections, we've already briefly looked at the page there. Standard stuff, what you'd expect from the sim. You can open the aircraft doors, operate various services via GSX. The aircraft actually natively integrated with GSX. As well, we have the ability for ground power, an air start unit, preconditioned air, things of that nature. For the briefing, nothing showing on my screen. I assume that's integrated with SimBrief. I haven't got that linked up with the aircraft. The checklist just gives you the standard abbreviated checklist for the bus. Mass and balance, as you would expect, gives you current aircraft weights and data. So again, showing a gross weight currently of 81.2 tons here on the weight and balance menu, which is actually different from what we just saw on the jet. Interesting. Takeoff we've already looked at. We'll carry out a landing performance calculation in just a moment's time. ACARS allows various message uplinks to the aircraft. Maintenance, of course, allows for various maintenance functionality. So, for example, here we can refill the engine 1 fire agent. Navigraph we've already seen. You can link up Navigraph charts. We'll brief up the arrival in just a moment as well. Tech log we've already taken a look at. And lastly, failures. We've already actioned a failure here, of course, for the engine 1 failure. But you do have a very comprehensive and realistic set of failure options. You can either activate those immediately or use arming conditions as well. That's just about it in terms of the tablet. Again, very functional overall. More depth, I think, than the Phoenix, maybe just slightly less user-friendly, though, than Phoenix's version of the jet. So we'll come back to the documents, we'll come back to the QRH. And of course, as mentioned, we are going to be overweight here for the landing. If nothing else, for the sake of the video, we are going to land straight out of the hold. We're not going to bother burning down on fuel. We are, of course, single engine here as well. So in terms of the overweight landing QRH checklist, the landing config as required, it does state, use the ECAM flap setting if required for abnormal operations. In all other cases, flap full is preferred. We'll be using flaps full. The ECAM doesn't require anything else. If the aircraft weight is above max landing weight for the go-around in config 4, we'll use config 3. You can see minus 17 outside today, so we're below minus 10, being very conservative. 2,000 foot above aerodrome elevation. 88 tons there, the limiting weight, and again we're about 82, so we can use config full. In terms of the configuration, we're basically going to disregard these notes. We're at such a weight that we can just configure normally. So landing distance check, we'll carry out the landing performance calculation in just a moment's time. Packs 1 and 2 off or supplied by the APU. We'll take the APU bleed on in just a moment's time. That's going to give us max available thrust in the event of a go-around. In the final stages of the approach, it wants a target speed of VLS. Again, we're just going to fly things normally for the sake of the video here today. So we'll just use managed speeds. On main landing gear touchdown, we'll use max reverse, only available, of course, on engine number 2. And as well, we'll apply minimal braking. So low water brake, we'll let the aircraft roll through, save the brake energy, hopefully avoid cooking the brakes. As well, we want to minimise our touchdown speed, of course, with the heavy weights. So just a very brief overview here of the QRH. Of course, this is not necessarily representative of exactly how things would be run in the real world. We'd be a little bit more diligent. QRH then is complete for the landing performance calculation. Once again, Rovaniemi, it'll be runway 21. The wind straight down the runway, so 210, about 7 knots now. Config full. Engine anti-ice on. OET is correct. Reverser will take no credit, although of course in reality it's 1 in op. Air conditioning will leave on, and the QNH is currently 989. And landing weight there showing 79.7 tons. I think there's a little bit of a discrepancy here between what we have actually loaded on the aircraft and what I have in the box in the MCDU. I was using SimBrief. It seems as though the SimBrief version of the 321 actually has a higher gross takeoff weight and allowable zero fuel weight. I think that accounts for the discrepancies. So for landing weight here, we're looking at a V-approach 149. And in terms of the landing distance, low water brake, so factor landing distance 2940. Available to us at Rovaniemi, we have 3,000, so we're pretty marginal there, but bear in mind that's not taking any credit for the reversers. And as well, once again, we'll brake manually as needed to actually roll and vacate at the end. Overall, not at all concerned with the landing distance here. We do have plenty of margin there up our sleeve. So that's good in terms of the landing performance calculation. I haven't found a way here to insert failures into the calculation. I don't know whether or not that is possible. I would assume, given the depth of everything else, that it would be. Anyway, lastly, we'll just brief up the arrival. So we are expecting, or we will be flying the RLS Zulu for runway 21 at Rovaniemi. The plate is 11-1. The identifier Romeo Oscar, it's 111.7, final approach course 204. There's a profile check 2,400 feet at waypoint INSAR. We're going down to the Cat 1 MDA of 810. Again, the aerodrome elevation notable at 643 feet. For the missed approach, it's very straightforward, climbing straight ahead to 2,500 feet. In terms of the terrain, again, nil significant, 2,400 foot sector MSA. Weather is as per the departure, so more than good enough here for the RLS. Just the icing conditions, the potential therefore once on the ground. In terms of the landing itself, once again landing runway 21, we'll vacate off to the left, coming all the way down through Alpha, full reverse as available, and low auto brake. In terms of our fuel state, we've still got 11 tons of fuel on board the jet, burning around 3 tons an hour, so well over 3 hours of fuel on board. Plenty of options, and planning on a landing, of course, in Rovaniemi. So that's just about it in terms of the briefing. We'll continue around the hold, and once we're inbound again towards Vekip, we'll cancel the hold and request the approach from ATC.
Radar, good morning, Videre 3 November Yankee 2003.
Videre 3 November Yankee, good morning, Roger. Identified, climb flight level 170.
Climb level 170, Videre 3 November Yankee.
Norseman 744, descent 4,000 feet, clear ILS 09.
Okay, so we are just exiting the hold at Vekip. We'll just carry out the last of our setup items here ahead of the approach. So in terms of the jet, the flight plan has been set up and checked for the RLS runway 21, navigator auto tuning. On the fuel page, as discussed, still about 4 hours of fuel on board the jet. We are developing somewhat of an imbalance. You can see we've got an advisory there now. That's to be expected, of course. We're burning down fuel here on the right hand side with the number 2 engine, not burning anything down here on the left with the dead engine. We'll leave things as they are for now. If we need to correct that later on, we'll do so in the missed approach. The performance, we can activate the approach phase. We'll come back to manage speed, and that is for the RLS 21 Zulu. We've entered the data, and we've got the Cat 1 MDA there of 810. And again on the progress page, we've got Rovaniemi runway 21. In terms of the weight, once again we are above max landing weight, 81.2 tons now. For the brakes, we'll go auto brake low. In terms of the other items, as per the QRH, we'll take the APU bleed on. For the 10 above items, we'll take the LS push buttons. And we have the landing light selected on. So just coming around the corner, we'll assume ATC is giving us a descent now down to 2,500. That's the intercept altitude for the RLS. And we'll just go with a vertical speed here of minus 500 feet per minute. In terms of the RLS, we do have Romeo Oscar identified. That is correct sensing. We'll wait until we've come around the corner here to arm it up. And in terms of the configuration, as you can see, green dot and VFE next are essentially the same value. We're going to have to, a little bit non-standard, come below green dot. Come back towards 220 knots. So again, non-standard, coming below green dot, but we can do it. The lowest selectable speed, VLS there, is what we can do with the auto thrust in. So continuing the descent, showing high here on the VDEV, but essentially 4,000 feet above the aerodrome, 70 miles to run, good in terms of the RLS. Below green dot now, so we'll go flaps 1. We'll come back now towards S speed. Again, it is a little bit frustrating not being able to click and hold for selections. I've got my mouse held down there currently, and you can see only getting 1 knot increments. So there's S speed. We've selected flaps 1, so the status page automatically brought up. No changes there for us. We'll remove the status. Lastly then, in terms of the approach checklist, the briefing has been confirmed. Decam status is checked. Seatbelts are on the barrier ref. We have a QNH of 989 on all 3 altimeters. The MDA, we have a barrow of 810 feet. And for the engine mode selector, that is set through to ignition. That's the approach checklist complete. Just coming on to base. We'll continue here to configure. We are below VFE next. We'll go flaps 2. And we'll come back now towards 180 knots. So once more the ILS is identified, correct sensing, we are cleared for the approach on a base leg. We'll arm up the approach. We have glide slope light blue, Cat 3 single, autopilot 1 and 2. And we might as well get a feel for how she flies, so we'll take the autopilot out. That does work with just the one keybind, which is nice to see. We have Cat 1. 10 miles to run. And looking good here now on the glides. We'll come back towards managed speed, make things a little bit easier. The manual handling, there's Loke Star, Glide Slope Star. Fairly high descent rate there, still getting the speed back at the moment. There's Glide Slope. And missed approach altitude was 2,500 feet, we do have that set. Yeah, so the aircraft feels pretty representative overall in terms of how it flies. I'd say pretty much on a par with the Phoenix. I think I still slightly prefer the Phoenix. People always complain that real-world pilots don't know what they're talking about with this sort of stuff. It is very subjective. Obviously we all have different hardware setups. To some degree we're going to experience the aircraft differently in terms of how we fly the real thing as well. But I can certainly say that both aircraft again are broadly representative of the real world jet. So we've got config 2, we are established on the glide, 8 miles, we'll take the gear down. Take the runway turn off lights on, those lights through to takeoff. And arming up the spoilers. Really nice lighting effects there as well. I don't recall having seen many aircraft with better lighting effects. There's Loke. We'll talk more about the flight model at the end of the video. Things are going to get pretty busy here in just a moment. We'll maintain 160 till around 6 miles in this case, keep things nice and conservative. We are though very much established on the localizer around the glide slope, and the aircraft seems to be giving us valid data there as well, which is not always the case in the sim. Speed is managed, so all we need to do here is configure. We are below VFE next for config 3. And again, it will be a config full landing. So there's 6 miles, we'll go flaps 3. Thrust really coming on now as we do so. Quite a bit more drag at flaps 3. It's getting a touch higher there on the glide. It's a little bit tricky to see the flight directors, at least under these lighting conditions. Okay, 5 miles, 2 reds, 2 whites on the PAPI, we'll go flaps full. I think overall the FSLabs feels just slightly more on rails than the Phoenix. Again, I just slightly prefer the Phoenix overall. The FSLabs also feels just a little bit sharper in terms of control response. If you really want to know how the aircraft behaves, I think in terms of the numbers, probably the FSLabs slightly better. Performance is a little bit lazier on a single engine, but you'd have to run some proper tests using pitch and power settings, things of that nature. I've yet to do so, and I probably won't. It's not really the kind of thing I like to do in the sim. If there's enough interest for it, maybe I will run a slightly more in-depth test at a later date. But again, we will at least talk about the flight model in more depth during my conclusion section of the video. So for the landing checks, we have cabin crew, they have been advised, auto thrust is speed, auto brake is low, eco memo, we have landing no blue, that is the landing check is complete. As you can see though, overall the aircraft is pretty easy to hand fly, as you'd expect from a fly-by-wire aircraft and certainly from the Airbus. 3,000 feet, no auto call out there, which is a little bit strange, but we are stable. So for touchdown, again, as per the overweight landing checklist, we use full reverse. We'll try and keep it a nice smooth touchdown. And we'll just leave auto brake low. As soon as we're happy we're going to make the last exit, we'll take the auto brake out, just let the jet roll through, let the reversers soak up some of that energy instead of the brakes. Of course, in this particular case, we've only got the one reverser, so engine 2.
100 above.
Let's check. There's land. And we'll see how we go here in terms of the steering. Again, we've not got the nose wheel steering available to us. Through the MDA, we'll continue.
200.
So just transferring to the visual picture now.
100. 50. 40. 30. 20. Retard. 10.
Okay, the aircraft feeling a little bit unusual there in pitch. You can see I've actually got the pitch auto call out. There's touchdown. We'll come off to the left here on hotel and back towards the bay. So there you go, guys. I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the FSLabs Airbus A321. Obviously we didn't quite make it all the way over to Manchester, but hopefully the flight was informative and the video has given you a good idea as well of what the product has to offer. Without a doubt, the FSLabs A321 is right up there in terms of study level add-ons. As usual though, I'll give you my overall conclusions on the product, so we'll talk through a few areas and aspects of the add-on. And as well, since I do think it's relevant, although I was never personally impacted by the issue, we will also briefly discuss FSLabs' previous history and their conduct. Typically as well during my reviews, I don't like to compare and contrast one add-on against the other. I like to let each add-on speak for itself. I do think in this particular case though, it is an exceptional circumstance. Of course, there are going to be many parallels drawn between the FSLabs A321 and the Fenix Airbus family. So where appropriate, I will contrast and compare between the two add-ons. Starting then with the modelling and texturing of the aircraft, certainly it is right up there in terms of add-ons that we've seen for Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. Very nice detailing in the cockpit, generally as well a good external model, although there are one or two areas there that are perhaps slightly lacking in detail. And once more, unless I made a mistake, as we discussed, there doesn't currently seem to be any cabin modelled. Not an issue for some, I'm sure, but for others it will be. And certainly these days I do think a modelled cabin is a pretty stock standard feature. I'm sure I know the answer to my own question here, but I'm not really sure why a developer would release a product ahead of completing the cabin. It's not as though FSLabs are in an arms race, they are late to the game, so they could have taken the time to complete things ahead of release. The cockpit visuals are for me, and I think for many, the most important area though. And overall the cockpit does look very nice, it is very immersive. Overall the visuals actually surpassed my expectations. That being said, and I think most of you will agree, Fenix definitely has the edge on the visuals. Overall, the texturing on the Fenix is more detailed, it does look more true to life. And same as well with some of the modelling, there are aspects of the cockpit that are more accurate on the Fenix. The external model is more detailed, and of course you do get that very nicely modelled passenger cabin. With regards to the flight model, firstly, I think it's worth mentioning, as I started to allude to during the approach, I see a lot of comments online and as well in some of my videos disparaging real-world pilots' opinions on such matters. Personally, I think those comments are unfair and pretty unfounded. I can't think of very many content creators that consider themselves to be the arbiters of what is realistic. I would be the first to admit that there is a lot of disparity between one pilot's opinion and the next. This is of course why we have test pilots. Trying to give you accurate feedback when there is so much disparity between user hardware, user settings, as well sim setup and aircraft setup, It's no small task. Nevertheless, of course, I do have some basis to give you feedback on what I think of the aircraft. And I don't pretend that my opinions are gospel, you can take them or leave them, but I do have a pretty decent idea of what feels relatively authentic in the sim. So we'll go through the flight model by phase of flight, starting with the ground handling. Again, I'm really not a big fan of the nose wheel steering logic that FSLabs currently have installed in the aircraft. I do have my rudder pedals bound to both the rudder and the nose wheel steering within the sim, but it seems as though if I turned off the nose wheel steering option within the aircraft, I didn't have any nose wheel steering. And as mentioned, with the option enabled, that also produced issues. The nose wheel steering, at least on my setup, does currently seem to have a little bit of a dead zone, so it was quite hard to make minor corrections. And overall, as mentioned, the response from the aircraft just felt a little bit all or nothing. I definitely think that the nose wheel steering, or at least how it's operated, is an area that FSLabs needs to revisit. Whilst I think they've gone for a more realistic option, again I do think we need to make some sort of concessions for the average user's sim hardware setup. So far as the takeoff roll went, the aircraft did feel very nice on the rudders at that point. With the loss of the engine as well, the swing felt appropriate. Very difficult to say whether or not the rudder input was accurate there. Again, my hardware setup very different versus the real aircraft. Overall, I probably did use a little bit more rudder deflection than would be realistic, but of course again that all depends on control sensitivity curves and things of that nature. Rotation felt good. Manual flight, the aircraft felt very nice to hand fly. The response and roll rate, things of that nature all felt pretty decent. Again, I do think the FSLabs aircraft slightly more on rails than the Fenix. And personally, in terms of handling, I actually still slightly prefer the Fenix Airbus. Though I do think in terms of performance, again very anecdotally, I haven't run the numbers, but the FSLabs aircraft seems to be more accurate. Same as well on the approach, the aircraft also felt very decent to hand fly. Again, pretty stable, but we were obviously in fairly benign conditions. The flare was interesting, the aircraft certainly didn't respond there how I was expecting in terms of stick input. But once more potentially being caught out by hardware, if nothing else there. Of course my Thrustmaster joystick not a one-to-one with the real aircraft. It is worth noting as well that we were heavyweight, single engine, but with all that being said I did come back on the stick, initially felt almost no response from the aircraft. So again, really had to arrest that descent rate at the last second, coming quite heavily back on the stick, and actually inducing the pitch auto callout. That is certainly not something I've ever managed to do on a real-world aircraft or indeed in a real-world sim. And I have as well managed a number of much more appropriate landings in the FSLabs A321. So whilst the behaviour that I experienced in that particular scenario was certainly surprising, and I think somewhat unrealistic, I'm still happy to say that it's probably down to a combination of factors. Once again, I think hardware certainly coming into play. Once more then, in my very humble opinion, if you want an aircraft that really feels like flying an Airbus, I'd still err towards the Fenix. If, however, you want an aircraft that flies by the numbers like an Airbus, then you're probably better off with the FSLabs A321. With regards to the aircraft and its system's depth, FSLabs here doing what FSLabs does best. The aircraft is certainly very feature-rich and in-depth when it comes to its systems modelling. I can't say, of course, that I've had the option to test the systems exhaustively yet, but I can certainly say that the aircraft systems are on a par with the Fenix, and from what I've seen, probably overall slightly more in-depth. With regards to the aircraft sounds, generally very nice internally. We did discuss there is a bit of clipping and a little bit of abrupt sound change at times. Overall though, I do find the sound set internally to be pretty accurate and very immersive. Externally, the aircraft does have some nice aspects. For example, the engine start sounds pretty good. But once airborne, I did find the engine sounds to be fairly lackluster. So during any flyby shots and indeed in the cruise, the aircraft doesn't sound all that great. Overall for me, in terms of the sounds, again I think the Fenix Airbus pips the 321 here to the post. In terms of product extras, this is another area where the FSLabs A321 really shines. The purchase, download and installation of the aircraft did feel a little bit old school. Nothing too arduous, but a touch laborious, and for example you will need to create a user account with FSLabs using your real world name, which in this day and age personally I just find a little bit invasive. As well, the installer flagged up by my antivirus software, which is firstly ironic and secondly a mild inconvenience for most, but may confuse a few users. I managed to work around everything of course, and once you have the aircraft installed you certainly do get a very deep level of simulation with lots of really nice and in many cases unique features. Firstly, although the package does only include the A321, you do get both the CFM and IAE engines, and as well you have the option for sharklets. The package also includes a significant number of real-world liveries, probably on a par again with the Fenix in terms of selection. As mentioned, the EFB integrates with SimBrief, Navigraph and as well GSX. And you do get a number of highly realistic and often unique features included with the aircraft. So for example, St. Elmo's Fires model, there's an icing model, custom de-icing model. We've already seen the tech log and the associated MEL. Brake wear and general failures are dynamic. You'll even get brake dust building up on the brake pads. Dynamic bug impacts on the windshield are even modelled with the associated cleaning task via the EFB. And even GPS jamming based on real-world data and locations is modelled, which might sound arbitrary, but it is actually becoming more of a prevalent issue of late. So the FSLabs A321, in terms of its feature set and overall realism, its ability to actually make you feel like you're flying a real-world commercial jet. Again, FSLabs doing what they do best. I think they have beaten the competition in this regard. In terms of documentation as well, the FSLabs A321 certainly a much stronger offering. We looked through the documentation available on the EFB, and that's actually something that's missing with most study-level add-ons these days. The Fenix A320, from memory, fairly light in terms of documentation, and even the PMDG aircraft these days don't come with FCOMs included. Proper manuals, proper documentation is something that is essential for flying these sorts of aircraft. And whilst you can find much of it online, of course it's much better to have it natively available, and certainly available within the sim. So top marks really for FSLabs on the documentation. There is pretty much everything you need there to be flying the aircraft accurately. And again, the manuals just bring you that much closer to the real-world experience. Lastly, in terms of the FPS, overall the aircraft seemed to be a pretty solid effort. I was getting about 49 FPS with the 321 versus 60 plus with the default Cessna 152 under the same conditions. Before I give you my overall thoughts on the product, again I think it is worth just briefly covering off FSLabs' somewhat checkered past in P3D. Once more, I personally wasn't impacted by any of the issues, and generally I don't like to comment on something I haven't experienced. But the situation as it unfolded was pretty significant, and I know it did leave a very bitter taste for many users. I won't go into great depth. If you want to see a video regarding that, there is a brilliant video by EasyJet SimPilot. I'll leave a link up above. But essentially, previously, as I understand it, FSLabs, in an effort to combat piracy, actually installed a form of essentially malware onto people's computers and were feeding people's own passwords back to the FSLabs servers. Obviously, the vast majority of us don't like to see software pirated, but that is an extreme and I believe even illegal solution to the problem. Ultimately, you're actually putting genuine customers at risk. We all make mistakes and poor decisions, of course, but from what I gather, FSLabs were not even that apologetic about the situation thereafter. Once more, that is not my personal opinion regarding the developers. I've had no dealings with them previously or more recently. Anyway, in summary, if you want an aircraft that looks absolutely amazing, then the Fenix A320 your best option. In terms of the flight model, very difficult to pick the aircraft apart. I personally would say that the Fenix A320 handles a little bit better, whilst the FSLabs 321 probably flies closer to the numbers. Systems depth also generally on a par, although I think the FSLabs aircraft does offer deeper system simulation, and as well with the more comprehensive dynamic failure system, the tech log, all of the features that we mentioned previously. Overall, the FSLabs A321 is a more realistic representation of an Airbus and real-world operations. In terms of aircraft sounds, the two again broadly on a par internally, although the FSLabs aircraft does have some issues with choppiness in sound transition. Externally though, currently the Fenix the clear winner there for me. Product extras, both aircraft are very nice, but you definitely get a more complete feature set with the FSLabs A321, and again the aircraft wins in terms of documentation. Ultimately, if you do want the most detailed Airbus simulation currently available for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and arguably for any sim, then the FSLabs A321 certainly does offer that. With that being said, I think the Fenix Airbus family does more than enough to satisfy most sim users, myself included. And ultimately, Fenix have been an amazing developer. You do get more value for money in terms of variants and types as well with their product. Whether or not you want to factor in FSLabs' previous history is of course up to you, but there is no doubting they have created an excellent product, and once more, this is probably the most detailed Airbus that I've come across in any flight simulator. Once more, to celebrate Christmas, there is a prize giveaway associated with this video, and as well a charity fundraiser, so please do give a little to that if you're able to do so. Links to both of those can be found down in the video description below, as well as links to YouTube memberships and my channel Patreon page, should you wish to support the content further. If you enjoyed the video, please do consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please do consider subscribing as well. As always, a very big thank you to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. It is very much appreciated. And to all of you, I hope you have an absolutely brilliant Christmas. Enjoy yourselves over the festive period. Take really good care, and I will see you all in 2025.